Hi, very good morning to you. It's Jim from maverickstar Observatory. In this upload I wanted to concentrate on just what we can ascertain from looking at some facts with regards to our sun and its current recent behaviour over the last 33 years, what we can draw from that and expect to come in the future. Before we do, great big thank you to those few people, as always, that support us with a little bit of funding on PayPal, Patreon, etc. Or you do some shares for us and thumb the video up and like it and things like that. It all helps. So what we can see today on the sun, there is one visible region and the sunspot number count at the moment is 13. What does that mean when we look at the solar cycle in general and the position of whether we're in solar max and solar minimum right now? Let's have a look. So as you can see, we've got the last 3 solar cycles roughly over about 33 years, each cycle being around about 11 years, but it can change. We've also got 3 points on each peak and trough of the cycle, one being the maximum, one being the average line, which sunspots usually follow, and the one being the minimum. And if we come to where we are right now, 2021, you'll see that where 13 is just on the above sine wave of solar cycle 24, and by all accounts right now 2021 we should be at the lowest point of a solar cycle and therefore be experiencing low numbers. But that doesn't mean that in 2015, when we was at the solar maximum, that we was receiving average amounts of numbers, even though they were higher than what we are receiving right now. If we followed the trend line of the maximum, it would put them around about 90 sunspots, but we know that wasn't the case, because if we look at the average line, we can see that the truth is closer to around about 60 to 70, which is still nearly a 50% drop on the current cycle. And then you can see there is about a 30% drop when we compare solar cycle 23 with 22. So there is a pattern of declining. So there's a couple of things we can note so far. Yes, there is a trend of declining sunspots over the last 3 cycles, covering a time period of 33 years. There's also something else, and the solar physics department at NASA Goddard is not mentioning it for some reason, and that is the actual position of where the sunspots are. Because when you start getting sunspots form around 30 degrees north and 30 degrees south on the disk, it tells us that, in general, when we have solar cycles and sunspots form in these regions, that tells us that we're in solar maximum. When they're close to the equatorial region, it means we're in solar minimum. But as you can see today, there is, although it's not counted as an active region, it is a numbered region on the sun, and I have pointed out sunspots being in these regions at these lower latitudes and above the equator, further north, so around 30 degrees north, 30 degrees south. That tells us that the solar cycle is in maximum, and we've been seeing this, and NASA's not been mentioning that. And it does make you very suspicious when these departments that are funded with tens of millions of pounds, they have the affordability and they are able to put satellites up there like Stereo A, Stereo B, which monitor both sides of the sun, and yet they don't report on some of the very obvious and noticeable things that are changing with our sun to the general public. Why is that? So just so that you're not just taking my word for it, we've got 2 discs in front of us. One is July 19th, 2020, and the other one is March 18th, 2009. The one on the left is obviously a sun which is in maximum during solar cycle 23, and the one on the right is in solar minimum at 2009. We can check this on the map just to reiterate the fact that the one is in a maximum, the other one is in a minimum, even though we can see the location of the spots and the positions with regards to whether it's above the equatorial or below the equatorial region. We can see just by looking at it that that is a sun in its solar cycle phase of maximum, and that the other one on the right is in minimum. So just comparing where we've just looked on those two discs, where they fitted on the solar cycle 23, you can see that in 2019 it was almost at the main part of the cycle, so it was at solar maximum. Again, when we look at where solar cycle was during 2009, we can see that we're at the end of solar cycle 23. What would we expect if we continue to see numbers of sunspots decline over the time from this point out? I'll just show you. So if we look at this space environment overview covering 2014, the reason why we're looking at that one is because it's very difficult to get more recent environmental overviews, but the main thing and information is here in this chart that we need, and that is at the very right hand side, top three boxes, where we look at monthly sunspot numbers, daily sunspot numbers, and then we got the Moscow Cosmic Rays Index there as well. The reason why we're interested in those, and at that point in time in particular, is because it was at the solar cycle 23 during the maximum, 24 during its maximum. We haven't got the data on this chart where it goes into the minimum, but I can tell you what it'll look like anyhow based on the information that we've got. But the most important thing is the Moscow Cosmic Ray indication is positive and not negative during the maximum of the cycle, as it was in previous cycles when we look back to solar cycle 23 and solar cycle 22 and those ones before that. So not only during the minimum in between solar cycle 23 and 24, we see that there's a rise in cosmic radiation. We also see that even during the solar cycle maximum of 24, there was no dipping below that negative line. So it is a clear indication that radiation is increasing during the time when it shouldn't do or hasn't done before during solar maximum. Again, this is another point I raise with you guys, because this is something else that NASA have not came out about with just regards to solar activity. And it is taxpayers' money that they're using for this gathering of data, and yet they are not so forthcoming forward with the information, and especially some of their findings with regards to that information. Now, we know from a lot of research that's been conducted on sunspots and their recent behaviour is that the umbra, which is the darkest part of the sunspot, has increased in heat by about 45k, and as a result of that, the sunspots, which are mainly electromagnetic generatedly behaviored, are decreasing in gauge by around 77%. And obviously this does not favour the production of sunspots. What we aren't so sure as why the sun has at its surface at least increased by that 45k, which has made it more difficult for sunspots to form, as a reduction of the magnetic intensity has reduced by around 77k gauge. So we've got an idea of what's going on, to the point that we know that sunspots find it very difficult to form under these new conditions. But what we're not sure of is why these conditions were set up at the beginning. Why has the sun got hotter? This is something like that's not clearly monitored like the sunspot numbers are, and have been over a long period of time. So there is a behaviour pattern with our sun. First of all, in the reduction of sunspot numbers, there is also a behavioural pattern which has changed with regards to where sunspots are forming now, as opposed to where they should be during solar cycle maximum and solar cycle minimum. And there is also very little information coming from these main organisations that are studying the field of solar dynamics and solar physics. What really puzzles me about all this is that the lack of enthusiasm to inform the general public. Now, I don't believe that scientists working on these projects for as many years as they have, that find these conclusions and this information about changes like we've just been talking about, I don't believe for a minute that they wouldn't want to tell somebody else as enthusiastic as I get about some of the things we talk about on here, because I believe if they're really passionate about their science their field of science, that of course, given an opportunity, they would like to tell people their findings. Now, is it the organisations that say you're not allowed to? Or is it mainstream media just not having the enthusiasm to cover the stories? Or is it a conglomeration of the two? Is it the organisations and the media working together to not inform people? Because I will say this, when there's an agenda that they want to push, like false science, such as CO2 and man changing the climate as a regard to his teeny weeny bit of CO2 he puts into the atmosphere, there is a drive from these scientists to come forward from their organisations and also appear in media. Now, that just can't be mere coincidence that these topics find themselves in the media. These topics have been cherry-picked specifically to be put in front of you, in front of viewers, and the information in front of viewers, so that they can be informed as to what these organisations are now telling them. But the problem is that the information, as we are seeing now, has been so badly represented by these organisations that it was very easy for even ordinary scientists, not particularly in the field, just having a little interest in that field, to prove that these things that were being said, such as like what's being said about the CO2, was nothing more than a lie. And it's understandable why it was used in other ways, or other words. It was an excuse to put a big kitty of money together and lose it in small observatories and businesses, and have it kicked back to the people that work in government. And this is something that is always being sought out by mainstream governments today, or world governments today. And I could give you a few examples. NATO is a perfect example, and very questionable as to what threats they say we need to be part of NATO, and how much money we put into NATO, protecting ourselves from the boogeyman, and we know who that is, don't need to mention it. But when you look at what's going on with things like NATO, and you listen to both sides of the argument, well, it is Europe, the United States, and a lot of other countries that have put money into it and then positioned missiles strategically all around the borders of another country. It isn't the country that they are accusing of being such a threat that has done that. So, it is, with regards to science, that's going down, that's deviating, talking about NATO. I'm just, bringing up the fact that it's a big funded organisation by world governments, as well as the World Health Organisation and all the other organisations out there that receive millions and millions of pounds of taxpayers' money and then misinform them of the truth. But this is a very common practice now. They look for excuses to generate kitties of money, and then year in, year out, the monies need to be put there again and again and again. And I don't believe that half these millionaires have actually, earned that money. I think more along the lines, they've managed to con that money out of them. And we're seeing a new rising class of elites that really don't care about the truth of science. They don't care about science at all, so long as it serves a purpose, as it has done with environmental issues such as man-made CO2 and stuff like that. But this is where we are, and this is why really good scientists are walking away from the field of science in their particular fields of expertise. And that is very sad, because without science we certainly wouldn't have the technology that we've got today. That was conducted by honest scientists doing the jobs really well. And today we live in a world where it doesn't matter what the findings are of science. It matters more about the political agenda to raise money as a result of that agenda. So that is a very dark day that we're living in, and that's why I can't stress enough, we've got an honest observatory here, monitoring and trying to, fill in the spaces of where these big organisations are letting people down and not informing them. And we're trying to do it, in a very honest and truthful way. And that means we've had to go out there and manufacture some equipment ourselves, like the magnetometers we've got in different parts of the world. And we've had to write the programs for them because we've had such little funding to do it. But nevertheless, we are collecting data accurately and as much as we possibly can from those locations to understand what is really going on, so that we don't have to rely on these other organisations which are failing despite receiving £100,000 a year salaries some of these scientists are on, and their organisation receives tens of millions of pounds. That is what we're up against, and they want to go out for little observatories like this in any way they can, because it's very easily disproven when the facts are laid on the table. I think you'll agree. Guys, that's why there's a link on this website that rarely gets pressed. 10,000 views, very few people press the link and make a small donation to keep the observatory going. At the end of the day, it's keeping the truth going. There's also a PayPal link in the description, and of course you can become one of our patrons. It's up to you. We're doing what we can to help you help us, basically, at this observatory, but the main thing is keeping it going. I think you'll agree with that. So you've heard some very interesting facts about our sun, its recent behaviour, and perhaps not something you've heard before if you're new to the channel at least, or if you are a regular follower and been following for a while. Hopefully the more times I put this into the picture, and build what it is that we're looking at over a series of shots and data, at least it becomes clearer to you that we are living in a great time of change, and not just because our sun, which is at the centre of our solar system, is changing, but also the magnetic field on this planet as a result of the magnetic pole shift. Guys, in about 5 days time, as you know, we're going to be on the 17th of the month, and we'll be pulling that data off the Trimag system and pinpointing the latest position on the magnetic North Pole. And it's really excited at the moment because we've got 2 consecutive months where on average it has travelled faster by around about 18-19% than it usually does over the months that we've been studying it. So that I'm sure is something you'll be wanting to have a look at and see if it's still following its new trend. Guys, links down there if you want to help support the observatory, and you have an amazing day. Look after your loved ones, as always.